The sun trickled into the cave through the top of the pile of rocks. Tamara stretched as she stood, and the events from the day before tumbled through her mind. She struggled to wrap her head around Ernest killing the king. Tears stung her eyes as images of the sword slashing off the king's head flashed before her. Maybe she didn't know her husband as well as she thought. She stepped up to the mouth of the cave and reached out her hand, aiming for the rocks covering the entrance. With a steadying breath, she lifted her hand, and the pile of stones rose and moved to the side. Tamara walked out into the early morning sunshine, soaking up the rays of light filtering down through the tall pine nut trees. Her first instinct was to run to the circle and transport to Hartwell, the palace of the witches. But Ernest knew where the circle was now, and if he was smart, he would have guards waiting there to capture her if she was dumb enough to show up. She would have to travel by foot to her private hut and teleport from there. Keeping the secret house from Ernest for the last couple of years had been hard, but now she was glad there were still some things he didn't know. She headed east, away from the castle and the ring of stones. It was a beautiful day, and she might have enjoyed the walk had it not been for the despicable deeds of her husband nagging her every thought. Ernest had never been interested in power before. He always told her he was happy just being a soldier. When had he changed? After 40 years of marriage, she should have been able to see something was wrong. His betrayal stung, but the way he looked at her in the castle, like he cared nothing for her, stabbed at her heart. In the span of a heartbeat, she had watched her once loving husband become a completely different man, a man she didn't recognize, and she had no idea what could have caused him to become so violent. She didn't have time to think on the matter any longer. A patrol of soldiers was headed her way. She ducked behind a large oak tree, surrounded by a briar patch. Fear gripped her chest, and she tried to make herself as small as possible, hoping they would pass by and never see her. She crouched down, closing her eyes as she waited for the men to march by. 4 rows of 3 soldiers stomped past, their boots kicking up dust. Tamara covered her mouth and nose with her hand to stop herself from coughing. When the dust settled and the sound of marching feet could no longer be heard, she allowed herself a sigh of relief to slip through her lips. The group was small. She could easily overpower them with magic, but then she would be weak and might not be able to perform the spell to teleport to safety. After several minutes with no sign of any soldiers, she crawled out of her hiding spot to start her long trek once more. She hadn't even taken 2 steps when a young man stepped out from behind one of the trees along the path. Tamara stopped. Her heart jumped into her throat as she held up her hand, a fireball resting in her palm. "Take another step and I'll throw it!" The young man raised an eyebrow. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would have told the others where you were hiding." She narrowed her eyes at the man, but didn't extinguish the flame. "What do you want?" It was plain to see he was a soldier. The metal breastplate and red insignia gave him away. His boots and sword were another reminder of what he was. "I want to assist you." His armor jingled as he took a step closer. "I will throw this if you do not stop moving!" He stopped in his tracks and held up his hands in surrender. "I just want to help." Tamara glared at him as she tried to decide if he was stalling her until a larger mass of soldiers could get there. "You're one of the king's guards. Why would you want to help me?" "As I know you are aware, there's a new king. I don't like him. I don't like how he came into power. I refuse to serve a man who could kill in cold blood." Tamara lowered her hand and let the ball of fire die. "All I need from you is to get out of my way. I know how to handle the new king." "How are you going to get around all the patrols out looking for you?" "That's not really your concern. Now please, get out of the way." She tried to step around him, but he blocked her path. Her lips formed a tight line as she glared at him. "Move, or I will make you move." His eyes widened as the meaning of her words sunk in. Bowing gracefully, he stepped to the side. Tamara walked past, watching him closely. She thought about knocking him out just to be certain he wouldn't cause her any more trouble, but she couldn't bring herself to hurt him, since he hadn't done anything to her. A few feet down the road, his voice rang in her ears. "The guards will be coming back in 2 minutes." He leaned casually against a tree, one booted foot crossed over the other, as he whittled a stick with a small knife. She blew out a breath. He wasn't going to be easy to get rid of. "And what do you suggest I do?" "You could hide again. That worked well the first time. But I would imagine you aren't going to get very far if you have to duck for cover every 10 minutes. That's the time between patrols. I can guide you through the woods, around the soldiers." The clanging of metal echoed through the trees. She didn't have long to decide. "Fine. Lead the way." Normally, she wouldn't need a guide. The forest was like her second home. She knew every inch of it, but she didn't know the patrol pattern. The young man's face lit into a smile. He folded the knife, shoved it into his pocket, and pushed himself away from the tree. "This way. Follow me, please." He seemed way too happy for a man who just betrayed his king. Tamara shook her head as she trudged into the woods after him. If she were smart, she would use her magic to render him unconscious and take her chances alone. This man wasn't like the other soldiers she'd encountered. Most of the soldiers seemed hard and uncaring, but this man had kind blue eyes that sparkled in the light and a carefree attitude that made her feel at ease. Horses' hooves pounded on the dirt, sending Tamara scrambling for cover in a thick patch of briars and bushes. The young soldier crouched down a few feet away behind a large green bush with little red balls on it. The horses thundered past, snorting. The riders yelled orders down the line as they rode, never stopping to actually search for her. The hairs on the back of Tamara's neck stood up, and she glanced over to look at the soldier helping her. Her eyes went wide. He was gone. While her attention was focused solely on the horses and riders, the young man had slipped away. She chastised herself for being so naive and trusting. Her need to believe all people had some good in them occasionally outweighed her better judgment. When she was sure that the men weren't coming, she slowly backed out of her hiding spot, spun around, and came face to face with the young soldier. "Where did you go?" "Relax. I had to check in with my captain." He turned and walked away. "Come on. We need to go before the patrol comes back." Tamara stayed right where she was. Warning bells went off in her head. He just talked to other soldiers. He was going to betray her after he gained her trust. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. "Thank you for your help, but I can manage on my own from here." He stopped and turned to face her. "You still don't trust me?" "I'm Drew. I work for the Order." She stared at him. "I didn't know the Order still had anyone inside the castle." He seemed so young to be a spy among the king's men. She furrowed her brows, taking in the man before her. The sleeper, as they called him, hadn't been used for many years. This couldn't possibly be that man. He shrugged his shoulders and started walking again. Tamara followed behind, playing over in her mind everything she knew about the sleeper. There wasn't much. Only Hunzel knew who the man was. All she had were bits and pieces of information she overheard from others on the council. She wasn't high enough in the Order to be privileged with that information. Tamara was content for the moment to go where Drew led her, while her mind tried to make sense of things. Suddenly she stopped and looked at the woods around her. She never told the soldier where she needed to go. So where was he taking her? To her left was a crooked tree with the top broken out of it. To her right, a dry creek bed. She knew where they were headed, and it wasn't a safe place. She called upon her magic and produced a rope of white lightning. In one swift motion, she spun the crackling string of light around Drew and pulled him back against a tree. The whitish-blue glowing rope wrapped around the trunk, holding him in place. "What are you doing?" Drew struggled against the magical rope, but without magic of his own, it was no use. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize where you were taking me? The new king knows where the Ring of Stones is. He'll have men there waiting. You're working for him." The man quit struggling and shook his head. "I'm not working for him." "Well, I'm kind of working for him, but not in the way you think. I mean, My loyalty lies with the Order. I vow it on my life. The Order doesn't exist anymore. I'm sorry. I can't trust you. She lifted her hand, and levitated a large limb, cringing as it cracked the young man on the head and his body went limp. The rise and fall of his chest let her know he was still alive. She released him from her magic and let his body slump to the ground. This was a journey she would have to make alone. Time slowed, and Tamara found herself hiding every 10 minutes as soldiers patrolled the area. Thankfully, the woods were thick with bushes, briars, and large trees. The closer she got to her destination, the less she saw of the soldiers. After 2 hours of walking and ducking for cover, she made it to her secret place. Tucked away deep in the woods sat the small hut. She'd only used it a handful of times, and no one but her and Hansel knew about it. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing one room with a fireplace against the wall. Dried herbs posed on the shelves and glass jars, and a cloak hanging on the hook by the door. A thin layer of dust covered everything, a reminder of how long it had been since her last visit. A smile spread across Tamara's lips as she sank down into the old rocking chair to rest her weary bones. Her 125 years were catching up to her. She'd aged drastically in the last few years, and this incident with her husband and the king had only aged her more. She closed her eyes, enjoying the quiet of the cabin and the isolation of the woods. With a longing sigh, she stood and collected the herbs to perform the transportation spell. It was one of the very few spells the Council of Elders allowed the witches to use plants to perform. The use of herbs and plants for spells had been banned long before she was even born. She carried everything in her hands, having lost her bag somewhere along the way. She wasn't sure if it was still at the castle or in the woods. Not that it mattered. It, along with its contents, was gone, and she would have to make do. With a heavy heart, she walked the short distance to the stones and sat down to focus her thoughts. She laid out the herbs and started the spell. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement again amongst the trees. Her heart raced, and her stomach twisted in knots. They found her. She rushed through the spell, hoping to complete it before anyone stepped inside the circle. The wind picked up, swirling dirt and leaves around her. Through the cloud of dust, she saw a man run toward the stones. Frantically, she looked around, trying to keep him in her sight through the haze. A flash of light made her shield her eyes. A strong hand grabbed her from behind, and she swung her arms wildly. The wind blew through the circle, picking her and the man up off the ground, spinning them around before another flash of light nearly blinded her. The wind stopped, and she landed on the ground with a thud. The man landed right beside her. She rolled away and jumped to her feet, a red glowing ball of fire ready in her hand. "Stop, please!" The man held up his hands, palms facing out. "I just want to help." "True?" The fireball dwindled slightly. She was getting weaker. It wouldn't be long before she lost consciousness if she wasn't careful. "What are you doing here?" He looked at her and smiled weakly. "Thought you got rid of me, didn't you?" She lifted her hand to throw the flaming red ball, but it extinguished instead. Her power was fading. She had to do something quickly. She rubbed her hands together and managed to get a small spark of electricity and send it sailing in his direction. It thumped him in the chest, and he stumbled backward a few steps. "Ow! That hurt!" He stroked the area where the blue light hit while narrowing his eyes at her. Tamara's legs shook, and the world spun around her. Panic gripped her chest as she crumbled to her knees. Seconds later, an arm slipped under her back right before she hit the hard dirt. Her eyes closed, and darkness seeped in.